Take it away.
Hello, my name is Ben Martineau, and I'm an advocate for Homeless Voices for Justice. Homeless Voices for Justice is a grassroots organization organized by people who are or have experienced homelessness. We seek to empower people experience homelessness, poverty, whose perspectives are often excluded from the development of policies and politics through protest, education, positive policy change, and reform. As part of our annual You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign, we are interviewing candidates running for local, state, and federal offices on issues that are important to us in our community. Today we are talking to April Fournier, who is running for the Portland City Council at-large seat. Could you please introduce yourself to the voters and tell us why you decided to run for City Council and what are your top priorities?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everyone else for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm April Fournier. I live here in East Deering with my 4 kids, husband, and 2 dogs. We've been here since 2006. I actually grew up in southern Maine across the bridge in South Portland, and then moved back here when my oldest son, who's now 19, was just about a year old. So we love Maine, we love Portland. It's really been a dream to be back here. The reason I decided to run for council at this point in my life is I've been really interested in politics really since the administration changed in 2016. And I never thought we would get the president that we got, but I even more so as an educator did not expect to get the Secretary of Education that we got, someone who has no experience in politics or actually no experience in education. And she became the Secretary of Education. And that's the first time I've ever watched C-SPAN in my entire life and yelled at the TV for probably the entirety of her confirmation hearing. But that told me that I really wanted to make sure that even though I couldn't impact things at a Washington level at that point, I could certainly get trained and learn more about running for local office. And so I applied for the Emerge Maine program, which is Democratic Training for Women. So I could just learn what it's like to run a campaign, how to run for office, and what office I might want to run for. Of course, things, are busy and you kind of have to wait. It's like double dutch. You're just kind of waiting for the right moment to really find the race that's going to be the right race for you, depending on where your life kind of opens up opportunity. And so this year, with the unfortunate pandemic that we are going through together, created some opportunities for space for me in my life to be able to run for city council. I'm grateful for everything that our current counselors are doing for us. It is a lot of hours of work and not a lot of money. So there's a lot of things that you have to shoulder as a leader in the city. But I think there are things that I'm really passionate about, coming from an education background, coming for someone who has advocated for their own children within the community, and really feel like we need to have all of the voices at the table. And I just don't feel like that's been happening as often as I would like to see it. And so what my goal is as a counselor is to really make sure that I'm an inclusive counselor. Whatever conversations we're having, whatever ordinances we're creating, whatever policies we're making, wherever we're moving funding, my goal is to make sure that we have all of the people at the table that are going to be impacted by those decisions or may have input for those decisions. Because just because I'm an educator or I've been a homeowner since 2006 or I have kids doesn't mean I cover all of perspectives that should be part of the conversation. So for me, it's critical to have different voices at the table so that as we're making decisions, we're really making whole decisions for everyone in our community. So that's really what has made me want to run, and that's why I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Riley, do you want to take the next question?
So this question refers to unsheltered homelessness. Currently, Portland is experiencing an unsheltered homelessness crisis. There are many reasons why people don't use city shelters, including criminal trespass orders or restrictions, feeling unsafe at the shelter, feeling disrespected by shelter staff, and more. The city has failed to adequately address these reasons why people choose to or are forced to sleep out. What will you do to address unsheltered homelessness in Portland?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the first place I would start is as a special educator, my life is lived around data and knowing if my interventions that I've implemented are working. And if I'm collecting data, it's going to tell me, yes, something's working and a behavior is changing, or something is not working and we're seeing more behavior. And so I would approach that very similar to the shelter discussion and looking at the homelessness problem that we have here in Portland. I would want to know from a shelter perspective, what sort of data are we keeping on the services that are provided? And it's a customer service based industry. So we should be talking to the people that are accessing the shelter to find out, what are the complaints? Why don't you feel safe? And it seems to me that if we have all of these problems happening in our shelters, but we continue to fund and we don't change or we don't make any sort of adjustments, then we are definitely doing a disservice to our population. So I think more data. I don't want to delay things, of course, because I think that, as you're right, it is an absolute critical emergency that we address this. But I think if we're going to get it right, we definitely need to understand the foundation of some of these issues. So, talking to the people that access the services, collecting some data around, you say you're able to provide these services. How many people are you serving? What is the results of those services? How often are they moving into more permanent housing? So what are kind of the results beyond just that, I'm going to find you a bed for tonight, I want to find you a bed forever. And I think that's really what I want to make sure that I'm focused on. The other piece, I think, is I really feel like, housing is a human right. So we shouldn't have lots of obstacles thrown up in the way of someone being able to have a safe place to call their own. And I think once you have that safe place to call your own, you're able to then start working on the other things that might be impacting your ability to work or go to school or go to treatment or, take care of your family. So I think addressing all of that is contingent on meeting those really basic needs. I don't want to go over my time. But yeah, I think it is critical for all of us to understand that it is a crisis. It's something that needs to be addressed immediately, but I don't think it also needs to fall on solely Portland's shoulders. We do have the county, we do have the state, we do have, national partners that I think we should maybe lean into a little bit more and find out, what additional resources can our partners provide to us, and what other things are we doing to make sure that we're making this a greater Southern Maine community effort rather than just falling on Portland's shoulders. So I think there are other things that we can explore just by having some really good collaborative discussions.
So Carolyn, you're up and you're on mute, so just unmute yourself.
Okay. April, I must say that I've got my interview coming up in a few days. And I think I speak as well and as clearly as you are speaking.
Thank you, Carolyn.
I'm running for state rep, in case you're wondering.
Oh, that's right. Congratulations. Good luck in your race.
Smaller site shelters. While Portland is moving forward with a new centralized homeless shelter and shelter services in Riverton, smaller site shelters are national best practice. Further, COVID-19 has shown us that the large congregate settings are impractical and dangerous. Do you believe that Portland should move forward with the Riverton location, or that it should consider changing course to a smaller shelter model?
I think that's a great question, Carolyn. So I definitely believe, again, kind of falling back on that educator experience that I have, is if I have a classroom of 40 children, it's going to be really difficult for me to address each of their needs individually, to figure out, how to best move them forward in their own, individual learning styles and learning plans and learning needs. But if I have smaller, more targeted classrooms, I'm going to be able to really provide some individualized support in a more effective way, I think. And so that's kind of the way that I look at the, one large facility versus the smaller targeted shelters. I think the one large facility, so far away from, in-town services, not really easily accessible yet by our public transportation. And I think there's also a social component to it too. You know, from a mental health perspective, we know that social connections are critical. We've seen that with COVID and how it's forced us to really be separated from the people that are closest to us. And so there is, I think, a cost that is associated with that social distancing. So I think having something so far removed from where people might have those social connections, those are just as important to me as, you know, physical health and other treatments. I think having those social connections help people, you know, stay healthy. So in my opinion, I think I would love to continue to explore those smaller, more targeted spaces. And again, to your point, you know, I don't know that Corona is going anywhere anytime soon. And so really making sure that we are being mindful in how we put people in spaces so that they are, from, you know, a health perspective, able to stay healthy, and we don't kick off, you know, another small outbreak site just by housing so many people together. So I think those are some of the things that we maybe need to go back to, you know, the planning board and say, you know, the world has changed really in the last year since some of those conversations and planning happened. So I think we have to be, you know, adaptable and flexible and change with those plans. You know, we've had to do that from a school's perspective. We've had to do that from a medical community perspective. So I absolutely think as a city, we should be able to do it from that perspective as well.
Jim, you're up next.
Oh, I think Carolyn was saying something, but I think she's on mute.
Carolyn, we're not responding to their questions because we're nonpartisan. So though.
No, I know that, but she was saying that she didn't know where COVID was going, and I said I was alerting her that there was a newscast the other day saying that we're in for a third wave, and very soon. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I'm ready to jump in. Yeah, full throttle. Anyhow, as I mentioned earlier, I've been involved with Homeless Voices just for 20 years, but for 40 years before that, I was a master electrician, a contractor, and I was very easily able to provide myself with housing. But due to my struggle with alcohol, I became homeless. I'm grateful I've been sober since the year 2008, so I've got all.
Congratulations.
I've got that. Well, thank you. I believe I've got that under control. Over the years, I've spent time in numerous treatment centers like the Salvation Army, which is when I got involved with Preble Street because it was right next door. But I also spent several months at a good place on Mellon Street called Serenity House. Unfortunately, due to funding problems, that has shut down. So my basic thought is you know, recovery is very important for people who want to get into recovery, but there's a definite lack of services available, and it's kind of taken a back seat with this coronavirus situation, but the problem hasn't gone away. So do you have any ideas on how to make recovery services more available to people?
Oh, that's a great question, Jim. Thank you. And yeah, again, congratulations. That is an amazing story. And I'm so very, very glad to hear it. You know, I think again, coming from my perspective being, you know, in special education, and I actually work at a Head Start agency. So a lot of the families that we're working with have their kiddos in our care because they're going through, whether it's, you know, recovery treatment services, or they've recently experienced a job loss, or they're going through, you know, education, or, you know, we do have other children that are, you know, right now in the foster care system because the parents just are still trying to, you know, put their lives back together so that they can take care of their children. So I am, you know, a very firm believer in making sure that there are access to services to allow people to be successful and, you know, find their path to their better selves. One of the classrooms that we have at the Head Start I work in is actually an early child care classroom. So it's specifically designed for parents who are going through recovery treatment. And so we are able to take the kiddos during the day so that parents can go and access that treatment. So I think it's not only important important to have the treatment facilities, but it's also important to have the other services that make attending treatment possible. So you need to be able to, of course, have the funding to have those programs available. You need to have really good training for staff so that they are compassionate caregivers that are able to, understand, trauma-informed practices and understand how to help people through recovery. But also, childcare needs to be something that we're talking about to make sure that parents can access these services, and then make sure that there are also places for people to go once they have completed their treatment, whether it's, pursuing further education or, even getting involved in committees or groups like this where they can use their life experience and their stories to help others see that there is a way, out of their addiction, or there is a way to move forward and move beyond it. So I think, funding and support throughout the community is so critical.
Thank you.
Sure.
I got a question about availability of affordable low-income housing. When I was homeless, I already had a housing voucher, but due to the lack of affordable housing, I couldn't put my voucher to use. I spent 5 months homeless, which could have been avoided if there was more affordable housing. What would you do to expand affordable housing in our city, preserve affordable units, and prevent voucher discrimination?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that I have found, and I'm still doing a lot of reading on, is, the housing first model, and making sure that I know we have a few different locations here in Portland, but we don't have nearly enough. So I think, as we're looking at further development, as we're partnering with builders in Portland, it's really critical to make sure that, we don't have any sort of discrimination. So there's not a separate entrance for people who have vouchers, or, a separate part of the building that's for, people who have vouchers. It is, it's designed for everybody. One of the things I would relate that to is the way that schools have moved, for kiddos that receive free and reduced lunch. They move to everyone enters in a PIN for their lunch. So there's not a differentiation between who gets that support and who doesn't get that support. And so I think that's really important, is to also, remove the stigma so that people aren't othered. I think the other piece to making sure that our buildings are, affordable and built to serve the community is when we're working with developers, making sure that they are hiring responsibly. So they are using, union workers that are being paid for, what their actual trade is. I think that's so critical. So you had mentioned that you were an electrician. If you're being, pulled into a job to help, wire a new development, you should be paid as an electrician. And I think that's so critical. So I think if we're going to make sure that housing is affordable, we have to kind of also create fairness and equity across the system. Again, I think, like as I answered before, partnering with our communities too, to make sure that we're getting support from the county, from the state, as much federal money as we can pull in as possible, because there's only so much space that we have, and there's only, so many options and locations. But I think if we're able to work with some of our community partners, we might be able to find more spaces and better ways to be able to create this housing a lot faster. As you mentioned before, it's a critical need, especially in the middle of a pandemic.
Thank you.
Sure.
So both COVID-19 and police brutality have shown us that we need to focus on systemic racism in this country. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are overrepresented in both homelessness and poverty, especially here in Portland. What will you do to dismantle systemic racism within Portland social services? And how will you prioritize the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents?
I think that's a great question. So as an Indigenous person myself, I am very keenly aware, just the injustices that exist for our people. In COVID right now, my tribal nation, the Navajo Nation, is one of the reservations in the U.S. that had the highest rate of COVID infection at the peak of COVID here in the U.S. And just the lack of infrastructure, the lack of federal money going in, the lack of resources really impacted our tribe significantly. And they're just finally having days where they haven't had new cases. And this is, a population of like 300,000. So it's not really, huge either. but there's not a lot of outside help that you can have coming in. So I think just having that understanding and recognition that there is not equity across the board is kind of step one. I'm also a member of the Police Citizen Review Subcommittee here in Portland, and so I've been able to hear some of the cases that have come through around citizen complaint. It's not a perfect process. It certainly is not a committee that has a lot of power. So one of the things I'm hoping to accomplish before the end of the year, before I move on to being the next at-large counselor, is making sure that we are continuing to push the city manager for more oversight as we can within the ordinance. So you're a little bound by what the ordinance says, but it does say that we can ask the city manager for recommendations to improve. So part of the, making sure that we're having a more just system is making sure that those who have power, so like our police force, are being, I don't want to say criticized, but also, we have some critical conversations around use of force reviews and internal complaints and some additional information around arrest data. So just, I think there needs to be more conversation internally from objective partners so that I think you are held a little bit more accountable when it's not your friend or your coworker that's checking your work. It's someone who is from the community checking your work. So I think that's another way that we can certainly create a little bit more equity, is having more oversight by those that do have power.
So Jim, you have the next question.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting. I've attended a few meetings of that police review subcommittee. My friend Maria Testa made me aware
Oh,
of
yes.
its existence. Oh, you know Maria? I'm sure you do if you're on that committee.
I do, yes.
But anyhow, my question is basically about inclusion. I mean, I've been involved with this group for a long time, and we've always worked to have homeless people involved in being at the table and being involved in making decisions. We've had a Homeless versus Justice State House Day, and we brought homeless people up to. We had 3 sit-downs with Governor LePage. We haven't had any with Governor Mills yet, but I hope we will in soon. And in the past, we've brought people up from the shelter to testify at City Council. We've had to make negotiations with shelter staff so they would have their beds saved for them. So it's always complicated. So, what ideas do you have to have homeless people involved in the decision-making process?
Oh, that's a really good question, Jim. I think one of the things that what you just said, goes right to my heart. You are, one way being excluded from the conversation, because if you go to participate in the conversation, you might lose the place that you're supposed to have to sleep for the night. And that is just, that's heartbreaking. So when we start to throw up roadblocks for others to participate in the conversation, that's really when we start to exclude voices. And so for me, I'm a special educator by profession. And so my entire life is inclusion. I'm really trying to work with kiddos with disabilities to try and help them be more included in the classroom, fighting for them in their individual education program meetings to make sure they're getting access to equitable services. And as the parent of a child with a disability, doing the same thing, whether it's testifying at the State House or, sending letters to the school board or council, advocating for the services and the funding to continue. I, am committed to making sure that all of the voices are at the table and that we are removing every barrier possible to make sure that that happens. I'm a working mom, so trying to make, meetings at, 11 a.m. on a Tuesday can be really, really tricky. So I think there are also some things that we need to look at from an infrastructure perspective as, city leaders. What can we do to make our meetings more accessible, more understandable and inclusive, make it easier to participate. As challenging as COVID has been, I do appreciate that things are being done through Zoom. As much as we all get Zoom fatigue, it does allow people to attend council meetings and committee meetings virtually, and then kind of virtually stand in line to give their comment. So I have heard from some parents as I've been out, and other community members as I've been out campaigning, just really appreciative of that, because they can be at home getting dinner ready or getting the kids in bed or doing whatever they need to do, but they're still holding their place in line and they're still listening to the council meeting. They're still able to jump in and provide that comment. They might still be able to be sitting on their shelter bed and jump in, if there is a phone available that has, a Wi-Fi connection. But I think that also speaks to there isn't an accessibility issue. And we found that with kiddos going home for COVID to attend school remotely. Not everyone has Wi-Fi, not everyone has laptops, not everyone has a cell phone that has internet. So we need to definitely figure out a way that we can help everyone be a little bit more connected, so we are hearing all those important voices.
Well, good, thank you. And I'd like to make you aware of something. Whether or not you become a city councilor, Portland has what's called an emergency shelter assessment committee that meets once a month, and it has a tri-chair set up. I'm one of the tri-chairs. Dan Coyne from United Way is the other tri-chair. Aaron Gare from the city is the other tri-chair. And Kate John attended one of our meetings, and we always would like to have city council become more involved in what we're trying to do to work on homelessness.
Awesome. And you said that's one time monthly? Sorry, I know it's totally like rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, it meets the third Thursday of every month, and it always met at one city center, but since the COVID situation, we were meeting on the telephone, so this whole thing is a big drag, but hopefully It's not going to last forever.
I'm with you there, Jim.
So
Another
Carolyn,
big drag is that, I tell you what,
Jim, I'm landing the plane.
Oh, I wanted 5 seconds, but that's okay. I can pass.
Okay. I'm going to pass the mic to Carolyn for the final question.
I feel like I'm stealing Jim's question because he always is asked this one. But if you are elected to city council, would you work and vote to uphold the city of Portland's long-standing 35-year commitment to provide emergency shelter to every person in our city who needs it?
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that I'm very just absolutely committed to and focused on is, serving our community. And there have been times, in our past as a family where we've had to access the local food bank, where we've had to access emergency services. And so I couldn't imagine those things not being there. And so I would absolutely work, to make sure that that is preserved, not only for my term, but really to make sure that after mine, it's still there and still solid.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with us, April, and we wish you luck on the rest of your campaign.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time, everyone, and great questions.
Thank you.